I'm excited to
Yeah.
share with you those.
So we have a lot to cover, and what you do is unique. It's very unique, and I think it could benefit a lot of people who are watching and listening, who are in the health field, who maybe don't know or don't have the same perspective on connecting the voice in particular with with sexuality and how those two interrelate. So do you want to just start by sharing what is the connection, or what have you found is the connection between the voice and sexuality, sexual health?
Well, the voice, the vocal cords and the sexual center are actually anatomical mirrors of each other. So it's a good place to start. In just looking at the voice itself, it's actually supported on these kind of postural plates within the body. And when there's trauma, when there is fear or hiding or holding back, what will happen is that there's certain muscular contractions. So for instance, there is a contraction of the tongue into the throat, and there's a contraction of the whole upper torso, the diaphragm becomes locked. And these physical patterns end up becoming the way we end up expressing ourselves. And they really lock in our energy, and they also end up forming our own sense of self-respect. We end up not feeling like people can really hear us. So I had discovered through my own trauma, my own sexual trauma, that my voice was more stuck in the upper center of my body. And I never really felt completely happy in myself and confident in myself until I started to map the details of the anatomical connections of expression and of just simply energy within the body. Mm-hmm. So the voice ended up really becoming a bridge into me healing my own sexual trauma. And it actually ended up really helping me kind of find a new way of finding health and expanding the range of what I thought was possible. And it really opened me up to a new world, really, of possibility, of really seeing the plasticity within our own brain and our ability to heal from trauma, which was really something that I always had the sensation was possible. Even as a child, I was unique in my own experience of my sexual trauma because I didn't black it out. I actually had made a conscious decision to remember it and to really write it down so that I wouldn't forget. And somehow I knew that it was important to actually bring it into my life and not hide it. Although for many years I had hid it, and wouldn't share it with people because that was sort of the training. Mm-hmm. So my work has really made me see the value in not just healing sexual trauma through the voice, but healing really any type of trauma. It's very important to actualize the expression of whatever emotions are locked and arrested inside of that trauma, because those physical locking the physical locks inside of the body are also an arrest of emotional energy that's not yet able to come to the surface.
Right.
So
great. Well, that's extremely important, and I that connection, and that's so clear the way you put it. So how did you start to then how have you started to work with clients to help them connect their voice to the rest of their body, especially to their expression or moving through sexual trauma in particular?
Well, my work focuses on really, again, mapping into those physical details of where the trauma gets locked. So a lot of the exercises that I do with people are really about going into that tension and then actualizing vocal expression, particularly what I would call more primal expression. So, for instance, primates, and this is kind of something that I like to share. around the work is that primates that engaged in social grooming practices, primates that were touching each other and communicating with emotional sounds, were actually accelerated their own evolution because they ended up forming larger neocortex in the brain. They ended up forming more complex social structures, and they ended up basically having the ability to use the hyoid bone, which is the only reason we can speak in language. So I just mentioned that because all of the work that I do is really about kind of unleashing the tension around this particular area of the body, and I'm bridging people back into what I would call embodied knowledge. So I would say that those primates were actually activating the fascial structure, which is all connected and tied to the brain. Sometimes we have this separation of we have our brain and then we have our body. Right. But when it comes down to it, your entire, fascial structure is totally webbed and interconnected neurologically to your brain. So a lot of the work that I do is waking up the neural connections through the skin, through physical touch, through self-touch, and through, again, working on these specific contraction patterns. A lot of them are manifest through the face and inside the mouth. There's quite a few. So,
so just to clarify for those who are watching a little bit more, what I'm getting and what I've understood from your work is really when there's a trauma in the body, or when there's a trauma in someone's life, especially if it's a sexual trauma, that person learns to hold back. There's kind of like a shock response that then becomes a permanent fixed posture. It becomes almost a rigidity in the body. And that through all the years that you were doing body work, deep tissue work, really learning about the anatomy and the fascia of the human body, that you could start to feel where someone had this rigidity. And what I find so fascinating about your work is that you discovered there are these holding patterns in people's bodies. And so it's a way to detect, does this person, have they gone through sexual trauma? Have they experienced, or any trauma? And so does that sound like a clear recap of what you were sharing earlier? Does that ring true in describing?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the more, I do my work, and the more I work with other professionals and kind of other people that have also mapped shame and trauma, you can start to see patterns. So there's definitely some times where I'll work with someone and I can sense and detect a sexual trauma without them even telling me, because there's certain physical patterns, that will be there. So I think on that level, it's very helpful to understand, so that someone, that's working with someone can kind of detect that right away, so they can approach them with more empathy, with more understanding, and also, perhaps be able to facilitate a release, that expression, which is arrested inside. It's exactly true. It's the way you can kind of experience that is if you've ever shared something with someone that you were afraid to tell them, and you released a whole lot of emotion, you'll notice that after that experience, oftentimes your voice will be more resonant. It will have more power, more depth, more continuity. And so it's, again, pointing us, I believe, in the direction that empathy, full expression of our emotional center, is actually going to be what allows us to evolve, and physically even evolve, and spiritually, mentally. And it's really the key to us activating what's cutting edge inside of our body. But it's also the place which we are most scared, because all of the social programming is really about, looks at vulnerability as a weakness, as emotional expression as a weakness. And we're not taught about the power of these things. And so what's so fascinating about what I've been learning with the body is that emotional continuity, this connection specifically of the voice to the sexual center, is the most powerful physical connection that you can actually have. And you can hear that in a singer that's really connected, for instance. And the singer will really be expressing those emotional tones, right? Without that connection, without that embodied connection, they can't reach those tones. And in looking at just even entrepreneurs, or anyone really for that matter, most of us have something that we want to express, something that we want to transmit out into the world, but without having these the physical connection, the integrity of the voice, our own expression will fall short. It will not land. It will not be received, because when we communicate, it's so much more than words. The words are maybe 10% really of what we're communicating. So starting to understand those connections, I feel will be really liberating on so many levels for people.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit more about the connection between the tongue and what your discoveries of working with the tongue, the jaw, the throat? Because I think that is it's very cutting edge. It's very innovative from what we know already about anatomy and what exists out there. But you've made some amazing discoveries, so I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the work that I had done previous to going into the voice was I studied for many years as a Pilates teacher, and kind of really looking at the core connections in the body and, what is core strength. And what I ended up finding through my work with bodywork was that I really started to see that there's this real strong connection between our throat and our abdominal center, our core center. And the tongue specifically is really a mirror. The root of the tongue is very much a mirror of the root of our core. So for instance, when you have a trauma, like let's say someone's coming at you with a knife, right? What do? Or you kind of contract back here in your throat, and you also contract in your belly. There's a kind of holographic contraction, as it were.
Yeah.
So, and also the vagus nerve, which is really our empathetic nerve, runs directly through the root of the tongue.
Oh,
so
wow.
When we experience that trauma, when we lock in, what happens is there's a chemical response where our body then speaks to our brain to produce more adrenaline. And the vagus nerve also runs all the way down into our internal organs. So it's all tied together. So when we hold back our expression, right, we lock in and we hide what we really want to express, what we're also doing is amplifying that nervous experience, right? The animal's constantly in fear. So a lot of the work that I do has to do with stretching the tongue forward, and for instance, and on releasing the tension patterns that are held deep within the throat, and then also using resonance sound to actually connect to the different bone structures, the fascia in the body, because the voice is three-dimensional. It's actually something that's within our body. That's why when we sit up straight, right, our voice is more dynamic, more supported. And when we cower and we contract in and we're hiding and we're not able to fully express and our tongue is locked, our voice will be very much weakened. Most people tend to think of the voice as just something that's coming out of the mouth, right, being expressed. And so their focus is directing it outwards. And what I found is that as a person really starts to connect the voice more internally, which is really a more vulnerable way of expressing, it's like actually feeling the sound energy within your own body first, before you're even concerned with, how it's being received on the outside, actually allows you to transmit a richer, fuller communication, because you're able to connect with those emotional tones, which I had talked about previously, with that those primates were connecting to. They didn't have language. They were able to communicate solely through these tones. And the only way they could connect with the specific tones, which had range and difference, was that they were actually felt within the body. But we've become so separated from our bodies, so disembodied, that now our language is actually imprisoning us, and on a huge, huge degree. We've separated, this is a this is a that, and we've disconnected again from the feeling of the three-dimensionality of the voice. So rebridging that connection, I believe, is something that will help us in our health, in being able to solve some of the huge problems that we have within our society, because what it means is it opens up the channel of our own empathy. And just in you responding with that tone that you just did, that humming tone, that is an example of that type of embodied expression, right? If you didn't have the faculty to be open enough to drop your sound into your body, that type of communication, it's not possible.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is lacking in a lot of our culture and our society, is that ability to transmit and to understand and to resonate with those emotional tones.
So that leads me to something which, we hadn't previously planned to talk about, but I think is really important. And that is that many clinicians and people in helping professions are always on the verge of burnout. It's like a constant teetering between complete adrenal fatigue, burnout, and resentment and tiredness and even depression. And I think the fear, many people go into helping professions because they care. They want to help other people. They do actually care. And then a lot of times what happens is so much gets loaded on. If you're a nurse, if you're a social worker, if you're a teacher, if you're a surgeon, there's so much loaded on that they call it, compassion fatigue, or just adrenal fatigue. It might even be the same thing. So how do you think people can access this empathy without, I think the fear sometimes is, well, if I'm empathetic and I'm open and I am compassionate, I'm going to be overloaded. I can't take all of this in. I'm seeing too much suffering every day, and I have to get my job done. And I can't possibly process all of this anguish that I'm seeing every day among my clients or my patients. So what do you think is a model that's healthy, where someone can be empathetic and compassionate and open and connected to their body in a way that you help people to do, really connect, to listen to the body deeply, without burnout?
Well, I think the first thing is to remember that we are animals, and to not, one of the things I think that really gets in the way of our own health is that we think we create these high standards for ourselves, like I have to be giving all the time, and I have to really put out all this energy because that's what it means to be a good person. But we are still animals. We are still we need to process our own emotional information first in order to then be able to help others. So a lot of the work that I do is really helping people to develop an intimacy with themselves. So kind of tuning into some of these more primal emotions that are oftentimes, let's say, considered darker emotions, that are, deemed as a weak emotion, but giving people a bridge into connecting with their own anatomy and keeping the energy open, because there's a difference between experiencing emotion and where there's shame. And this is a good distinction. So for instance, I can have anger. I could be expressing anger to you, and my throat could be contracting and my voice will be getting shrill, right? I'm expressing anger. That's one degree of anger. But because there's shame, and that's why there's that contraction in the throat, you might lose your voice in that kind of expression, right? There's a difference in really being holistically connected with yourself, intimately aligned with yourself, where you can hold that anger and feel it viscerally in your own body, and integrate with it, where there's freedom in the throat, and the expression doesn't have to come out as something violent or hurtful. It can actually just be communicating, this makes me angry, you know? And I think that that's one of the things that really causes the fatigue in people, is that, again, the suppression of the emotions. It's like we're able to take on other people's emotions, but then we suppress our own, and then we wonder why we're so exhausted. So I think it's really in, a lot of the practices that I do them daily. I really feel like we have to kind of tune to our own self, kind of find what is the music that needs to be played through our own expression. And that takes some discipline. And, but ultimately, there's a storehouse of energy within our bodies, and particularly within our embodiment of our emotions. When you're able to have an access point into feeling that, and to having also the empathy really starts with ourselves. It's not just having empathy with someone else, it's also being able to feel and, have patience for your own self. So I think that's another important distinction.
Yeah. Yeah, that we can't be superhuman.
Yes.
We're expected to be. And I think the emotional processing that you do with your clients and for your students is really excellent, because it does in a way bypass some of the narrative. It just gets into the physiology of the emotion. Right. It helps kind of detox and flush that emotional accumulation, and where it gets stored in the muscular holding patterns, which then creates tension and stress and then disease. And so I think, it's great to have an approach where we can process mentally and process intellectually, but also processing with our body, processing at the emotional level is so important, so vital. It's literally what returns vitality to our system. So if, for those who are listening, who are watching, who are in the medical field, let's just bring it back a little bit to sex and sexuality. How do you think it would change the way a person practices when they incorporate, they allow sexuality as part of the frame of how they're helping someone? Now, for you, you spent years teaching and doing body work. How did you come to integrate sexuality into that in a way that was empowering for both you and your clients, would you say?
Well, I think first of all, I found the actual anatomical connections. It wasn't for me, it wasn't something that was sort of, sort of more in the imaginative realm, or something that was elusive. It was actually like, wow, this is actually really the connection, that our sexual center is actually really the root of our entire structure, right? So it was a natural thing that I started to see. It wasn't easy for me to completely go into that right away, but it was something that I couldn't ignore anymore. Once I found the connection, it was like, okay, I can't ignore that. That's actually at the root of the structure, right? It would be wrong. So it really was just through the process of, diving deeper into that connection with myself first, with doing the practices for myself, and then just slowly aligning more, giving these tools to my clients, and really starting to see the results and see this sort of flowering of people. It was motivating to continue on that path. And it was also very liberating, because a lot of, like you had mentioned before, that sometimes, let's say, talk therapy is somewhat limited. But what I really find is that, the voice is one of the most incredible feedback tools. You can always hear with someone's voice what's happening underneath, what's underneath the surface. So if you sort of see where those contractions are happening, and then you work with the voice and with actually unleashing the tension patterns, you can basically do a lot of rewiring, subtle rewiring, without having to even go into the meta level explanations. Now, they end up happening naturally, I think, right? Once this energy gets released, oftentimes when a person will say, wow, I realize this, and it's so beautiful because it can actually come from their own realization as opposed to an outside force. And that was another thing that I really never felt that comfortable with, especially when I was doing body work. I didn't really want to, kind of fix people. I didn't want to be the fix-it person. I really want to be someone that's more of a catalyst for helping people to find their own source of empowerment. So that's really what it comes down to, is that I think at the core of our power is our sexual center. So anything that helps to align you with that is a really great thing. And
well, one thing I noticed, is as a practitioner, in the culture of helping others, whatever that role might be, there's a bit of a fear around addressing sexuality. It's like, oh, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to go there. It's a little bit confronting on both sides. So I think for many people, they're worried about the ethics, or they're worried about intruding. They're worried about liability issues, any number of things. So, but I've observed you at work, and I think you have a very clear way of addressing and supporting people around accessing their sexuality in an empowering way. You give them specific tools, you give them practices. It's really about educating them to connect to their own body. But what are some things you could share with those watching that would help people to feel more comfortable? What is it that helped you to feel more comfortable making those connections? And then, speaking to your clients about it, giving them tools, helping them discover that for themselves as well.
I think one has to make a personal choice, first of all, to align with your own sexual integrity, first and foremost. So, doing self-care practices that help align you with your sexual center and your true voice, I think, are really, really helpful. Because then you can work with a client and feel confident, right? Because you've done the work on yourself. I think that the times where I've felt more scared has been the times where I've been maybe less practicing of that kind of connection, where I'm not aligned. And so I don't trust my own connection with someone else and teaching them, obviously.
Sure.
So I think it really starts with doing the work on yourself. And I think that that's true for even before you step into a relationship. It's really aligning with that self-intimacy. And then it's not as scary, because you have the experience of doing it with yourself. But I honestly think that's one of the hardest things. Like, that's a hard advice sometimes for people to take, because so much of this work is so confronting on many levels. And so even as healthcare practitioner, it can be very scary to really continue to dive into the personal depths of what it actually means. Mm-hmm. And so I think that kind of hands-off approach, it really comes from fear and a lack of, a lack of courage to, first of all, explore one's own self. Because for me, once I started to find these connections within myself, it was like impossible not to want to share it with others. Do you know what I mean? You start to connect with the bounty, the treasure, the gift, and you're just like, it would be insane to not want to share that with others.
Right. Developing these skills takes discipline. It takes effort. It takes a commitment. It takes being willing to go beyond some of the fear that comes up and the shame. And I think, shame is another area that you've also done a lot of work in with people. And you've done it from a perspective, again, of accessing the body. Where does shame get trapped and show up in physiological expression? So could you talk a little bit about your discoveries, shame, and helping people release that, especially when it comes to sexuality, to expression, and to sexual trauma?
Well, my experience of shame is really that it's an arresting of these emotional energies. So it's basically, there was a trauma that occurred, for instance, and inside of that traumatic experience, it wasn't safe to express anger, right? It wasn't safe to express fear. And so those emotions became arrested and locked in a kind of sheath of shame. And so the way I experience shame is also that it's almost like it's a kind of net. It's connected to the fascia, very much so. Mm-hmm. And the fascia in the body is woven together throughout. So it's almost as though the shame plex, the shame, energy kind of got webbed and knotted, and it became then a persona, or, it became a kind of construct that people then identified with. So, so for me, for instance, in my experience of my own sexual trauma, I felt a kind of weak sort of victim, very afraid of expressing anything that was, sort of anything that was angry. I was very, very scared of doing that. And it was as I started to really experience, oh my God, this is actually a contracted container that I'm living in, and start to move out of that through movement and through sound and through actualizing the words and the emotional tones, that you start to kind of move into a new body, right? But shame just does manifest definitely within the physical architecture. And it's as you start to identify where it's coming up, let's say, it's every time for instance, I listen oftentimes to people's words. So I might notice as they say a particular word, that there's a contraction that will always happen, that their chest will cave in, or their throat will lock in, right as they're talking about a particular subject. Or it could even be whenever they're talking to a particular person. Oftentimes this happens when people are in relationship, and I've heard people, whenever they speak to their partner, their voice contracts and gets locked in a particular way, because it's very connected to oftentimes childhood trauma. There's this kind of transference into relationships. So, it's the first step is identifying, wow, it's happening. And that's an empowering space to be in, because if you don't know what's happening, you're kind of a victim to that shame.
Identifying what's happening. And then what, if you can, and describe a little bit about, what does a physical practice do? Maybe even, give a little sample of what you would do with a client or someone you're working with to help them somatically move through where they feel blocked, where they feel the emotion of shame coming up. What are some things that you do that with them?
So many different things, but one that I think might be easier for people to understand is that I work a lot through the face. So I work with giving people tools of actually going into the fascial tension within our face, because our face is our expressive center. It's where we express our emotions, right? So it's really where the sort of central root shame block is. So what I do is I guide people into releasing the tension patterns, and through using breath and also working with sound energy. But specifically, let's say working with breath to be able to hold the energy of that emotion, which is not yet comfortable being expressed. And so first finding the ability to express that emotion without sound or without words, but physically aligning, letting the tension go, speaking to the physical body. Because when we touch ourselves, when we actually move and into a gentle touch, into stimulation of the area, not in a forceful way, but in a directive way that says it's okay, to have this experience, this emotional experience. So that's a very powerful way of starting to release those patterns and shift the voice tremendously. Because oftentimes the voice is really locked because of those fascial tension patterns within our face.
So what have you noticed with people that you've worked with on a longer term basis and clients? What are some results that you've observed?
I've seen a lot of different things, but one of the manifestations is that people generally end up aligning with their creative expression. And we didn't really talk about that so much in this dialogue, but it's a very integral piece of the work, because sexual energy is creative energy. And so oftentimes when a person is locked in trauma, oftentimes there's a disconnection from their creative expression. And so what I find is that as people start aligning with their voice, they start to actually kind of get turned on around certain creative channels that maybe weren't being accessed before. And they start to move towards those and start to actually feel safer, in doing that. There's quite a few experiences working with clients where people kind of move out of unhealthy relationships. They start to shift relationship patterns and start to increase the sense of value within their own being, because oftentimes, not feeling valued oftentimes comes from this huge disconnect between someone's sexual center, because the sexual center is where the treasure is. It's like where the diamond is inside of the being. So that's another thing. I've also seen cognitive improvements. People's ability to express language improves, because really language is sourced from, I believe, embodied experience. It didn't just come from the mind. It came from, I believe, these primates that engaged in these social grooming practices, engaging in, communicating with these embodied notes. And I've seen people really healing their sexual trauma, which has been an amazing thing, because that's something that we really that we really don't think is possible. I think that for the most part, we see sexual trauma as something that just is going to leave the person broken to some degree. And it's
right, like it's going to be you're permanently damaged. You'll probably never get over it. Too bad. That's kind of the message. However, it does. I think there is an alternative perspective on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what I've really found with the voice, which is so incredible, is that our body is really built to support expression to the full tilt. And so when you have someone with trauma, what you have is also a jewel inside, because there's a unique expression that wants to come out, that wants to be unearthed. And when you start giving someone the tools to actually connect and to fully align with that truth, and to show them that it's safe, your body is actually built to support this energy. And I think that that's what's so hard for people, who have trauma, is that they don't know the way. There's not the clear channel, right, in how to do that, how to fully express, because again, those physical manifestations happen. The locking in the throat, the locking within the physical body. And there's this feeling like I can't get this out. Right. I can't find the expression. And so for me, as I started to align particularly my voice and my sexual center, I started to tap into a world of creative expression. And I started to really trust my voice, because I could feel it, not just here, but all the way down into the root. And I felt it all the way to the root. My physical body was held up. And science shows us that when we have an open posture, that actually also speaks to our brain chemically that we're safe. A traumatic posture, which is generally locked in and contracted and held, what happens is hormonally, there's hormones being released that are actually telling our body and our brain that it's not safe.
Right. We're always on a low-grade, vigilant fight or flight mode.
Yes.
The sympathetic nervous system is always somewhat activated, and then we can never fully relax or fully let go. And those holding patterns, those tension holding patterns, become locked. That's really, often how we see those tension patterns getting locked. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the ideas of that it's not safe become, basically reinforced through those holding patterns and through that feeling of not being safe, not feeling physically safe. So I love working with people that have intense trauma. I personally really, really enjoy it, because I find that within those people, again, there's an incredible treasure, oftentimes a jewel. And because within trauma, there's pressure, there's this pressure building inside of the body. There's just this pressure building inside of the person. And just like a diamond is formed from pressure, the same is true with our own trauma. So instead of looking at people with trauma as being broken or somehow weaker, I actually see it as, wow, there's an incredible jewel somewhere inside of there. And if the person is wanting to really deeply source whatever that is, it's an incredible experience to see it as it emerges.
Amazing. Yeah, that's definitely an empowering perspective. Definitely getting, another alternative to the pathology model of like, what's wrong with you, and you went through this, and or I have some dysfunction, I'm not able to orgasm, and I was abused as a child, and those kind of ways of thinking, identifying the self, as opposed to I'm this being that can expand. I can move through all these things. I can be my fullest expression. I can live the fullest potential that I have, which I see a lot with people that you work with, is that they do end up, actualizing a lot more of their potential, and which then automatically affects every other area of life. You can't but have a more vital, healthy existence if you're feeling released from that internal pressure, as you put it, of always trying to escape something, or always, on the lookout, always being vigilant. It's a lot of energy that gets wasted, or it gets put into being on the lookout, and instead of being in that relaxed state of flow and creativity. So it's really beautiful, really important work. And I think it's a great complement to the existing models of therapy, sex therapy, psychotherapy. It's a really great complementary approach, what you're doing. Any final gems that you want to share with those watching about, the voice or expression and sexuality, how these things interconnect?
Yeah, well, one thing that I'd love to always share with people that I found is that I really believe the voice is really the manifestation of orgasmic energy. It's an orgasmic currency. So, and the voice is intrinsically tied to emotions. So oftentimes I see, the world of orgasm being tied just to this kind of physical sensation realm. And we've removed it from the dimension of the emotional. And I think that really healing sexuality, we have to reconnect orgasms and emotion. And then we start to have to really look at our relationships and our connections and our own connection to our own physical embodiment as actually this constant ability to experience orgasmic energy. So the voice, when connected to the sexual center, is incredibly pleasurable. It's incredibly dynamic, but we have to be willing to bring back the emotional energy in order to fully bridge this connection. You can't just do it with vocal techniques. And that's one of the things that's sometimes difficult for people when they're doing the work at first. It's they want to just have a technique to kind of get there, but without having to go through any kind of emotional connection. And I really believe that because this is true, that I believe our sexual connection has a lot more healing potential. That the sounds, for instance, that we make in sexual connection has actually potential to heal the other. Those notes that we're able to express when we're not ashamed fully expressed, has the potential to penetrate the other, to experience the empathy, the energetic frequency of these emotional tones. So get sexuality out of just being a physical act or a physical sensation of experience, into actually seeing that it's very complex, and it's very rich, and that pleasure and its core is the welcoming. It's the invitation to experience all of the emotions.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, very well. Very beautifully put. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Absolutely inspiring. Yeah. So for those who are watching or listening, what's the best way for them to find you?
You can find me on my website at www.embodybymegwyn.com. And I also have a Facebook page, which is called Embody Voice. And you can write to me at megwyn.white@gmail.com. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and I know that you're also training other professionals and giving them tools. So, definitely those who are watching who are in a helping profession, I would highly recommend her work as an augmentation to what you're already doing with your own clients and patients. So thank you all for watching and being here. Thank you, Megwyn.
Thank you, Anita.
Until next time.
Great.